Hey everyone. So today we're going to be doing something very different from the other videos I've made on this channel. Today we're going to be talking about Spinch, a fairly unknown psychedelic platformer game created by Jesse Jacobs. This video is basically going to be a review of the game since I have quite a bit to say about it. Consider this the pilot episode of a possible future series I might make, where I talk about and review random games that I find. So I'm going to be separating this review into 4 different categories regarding the game: gameplay, design, story, and music. And I'm going to go in depth on what I think about Spinch in all these categories. Starting with... So, the gameplay in any game is obviously one of the most important aspects of it. After all, no matter how good a game looks, if it plays badly, no one will want to play it. Unfortunately, Spinch's gameplay is its worst category by far, and severely drags down the overall experience. The majority of the game is composed of either platforming through a variety of enemies and obstacles in order to make it to the end of the stage, or a boss fight at the end of each world. Now, as I said, the gameplay is the worst part about Spinch, but that's not to say that it's not fun to play at all. In fact, the first few worlds were quite fun to play, and I would even say that a lot of the levels have fairly good level design. But the biggest overall problem with the gameplay in Spinch is the inconsistency. Everything from the difficulty to the controls feels like it has little to no consistent behavior. The prime example of this being the massive difficulty spike from World 3 to World 4. Now obviously, World 4 being harder than World 3 is nothing out of the ordinary. The problem is that World 4 is not only harder than World 3 by a very large margin, but it is also harder than World 5, and maybe even World 6, given there's only one real level in it. Additionally, the unfair difficulty is extremely abundant throughout the gameplay, especially the boss fights. From attacks that have no recognizable pattern to straight up unavoidable ones, nearly every boss fight after World 3 is just a giant pain to play. There are also a few questionable level design choices, such as blind jumps and mazes, which take away from the enjoyment as well. Now, the levels themselves aren't solely responsible for the bad gameplay in Spinch, however. The controls are also pretty subpar. While at its core, Spinch features some fairly simplistic controls, with standard 4-directional movement and a simple dash, and the ability to wall jump and dash midair definitely helps give the controls a more satisfying feeling. The biggest problem with them is once again the inconsistency. During my 2 playthroughs of the game, there were countless moments where my character would fail to dash properly and result in taking a hit. Now, this on its own would not be that big of a problem, since glitches like this are inevitable. But the problem is amplified greatly by the sheer number of glitches and hitbox issues throughout the game. Take the one on the screen as an example, where I'm trying to escape a giant gum-gum, and after I dash, I'm unable to move forward despite the running animation still triggering. Or this one, where I'm clearly not touching the point of damage and I still take damage from it. There are several other examples showcasing these flaws with the gameplay, but the inconsistency regarding difficulty, controls, and the abundance of glitches all over Spinch made the gameplay extremely unenjoyable for a lot of the experience. But while I am being harsh on the gameplay, I do want to reiterate that it is not downright awful, but it is still below average and undoubtedly the worst aspect of Spinch. Now, moving on from Spinch's worst category to its best. To put it simply, Spinch looks awesome. The game's creator, Jesse Jacobs, actually worked on Adventure Time at one point. And while looking at them side by side, you can definitely see the similarities. However, I actually like Spinch's design more. Not only is the general style extremely appealing to the eyes, but the color usage is great as well. Obviously, the abundance of the rainbow colors throughout the game is the first thing you notice with the design. And they are very good for giving the game a psychedelic edge to it. But the shading and overall vibrance in the world of Spinch is also very captivating. Nearly everything from the enemies to the ground is filled with vibrant, beautiful colors, making the entire game feel super alive. Another thing I want to mention about the design is the detail, perhaps the best part about it. The level of detail in everything within Spinch is just astounding. There genuinely isn't a single frame within this game that looks boring, because everything has such great detail. From the rainbow circuitry lining most walls, to more subtle things like the animated faces in the background of levels. The effort put into the cartoony details all throughout is extremely impressive. Now, that isn't to say that everything about the design is perfect, as there are some segments that aren't very mind-blowing with the visuals, but even in those segments, the subtle colors and details are still pretty great. Without a doubt, the visuals in Spinch are amazing and set a very high standard for any future games made by Jacobs. In all honesty, there really isn't much to say about Spinch's story, other than it's perfectly fine. It's a very simple, inoffensive little story about a Spinch, the main creature you play as, trying to save its offspring from the living colors that prey on them. Obviously, it's not the most intense or gargantuan plot a game has ever had, but not every game needs to have a story like The Last of Us, for example. Sometimes a simpler story better benefits the game itself, and I think the story definitely does in Spinch. There are a few specific points I want to bring up about the story though. For one, I find it kind of weird that the whole goal is to save your babies from the color monsters, but in every boss fight, it has you shooting them at the boss. It just seems a little counterproductive, if you ask me. There are also the cousin stages in the game, where the main cousin makes you catch his children, and if you fail, they splatter on the ground. So I just don't understand why he's trying to kill his children. Unless, but all that stuff is just me nitpicking. Other than that, the story in Spinch is absolutely fine. Moving on to another category that there isn't really a lot to talk about. For the most part, the music in Spinch is pretty solid, with my absolute favorite song being World 3's theme, which is the music you're hearing in the background right now. The entire soundtrack has a very techno, synthy, and almost off-key vibe to it, but it definitely doesn't sound bad, and it definitely works with the design. I'd once again compare the soundtrack to the music in Adventure Time, though I do prefer Adventure Time's music a lot more because it does not have the same problem that Spinch's music does. The problem being the loops. I don't have a problem with loops in general, as it's basically a necessity with video game music. The problem in Spinch is that most of the songs loop very commonly, especially in the boss fights, where the loops are so short to the point where they're very noticeable. Although a big problem, that is the only major problem that I have with the music in Spinch. Overall, I find the music to be fairly decent, with some songs being absolute bops, and others being boring 15-second loops, which drag down the overall quality. So to wrap up my thoughts on Spinch, I think it's a very solid release, and I definitely look forward to any future games made by Jacobs. Spinch has some great features, like its design, but also some undesirable features, like its gameplay. My biggest complaint would have to be the gameplay, as the abundant glitches and general strange decisions made regarding it come off as very amateur and drag the experience down. But that is to be expected, as this is an indie game. However, the fantastic visuals and the solid music and story do make up for the lackluster gameplay, in my opinion. I would definitely recommend giving Spinch a try, so I put the download link in the description of this video. It is $15 though. So that's all I have for this video. I know this was a bit more experimental for me, but I just wanted to do something different. Like I said, if this video does well, I might make this into a series on my channel, where I just talk about random games that I found. So if you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe. And that's it. Thanks for watching.